Somewhere off the coast of England, beneath a cold and restless sea, there is a country that no longer has a name on any map. It has no borders now, no coastline, no shore where the tide turns. And yet, for thousands of years, it was the most lived-in land in this part of the world. Tonight, we are going to go there, slowly, gently. We are going to walk across a country that drowned. You don't need to do anything now. You don't need to follow every word. Let the sound of the water carry you. We have a long, quiet way to go, and there is no hurry at all. The sea will still be here. The land beneath it has waited 8,000 years. It can wait for you to fall asleep. The fishermen who work these waters have a name for one part of this sea. They call it the Doggerbank. It is a long, shallow rise in the sea floor, far from any land, where the water grows strangely thin. Only 15 or 20 meters deep, in a sea that is otherwise far deeper all around it. For centuries, no one knew why it was there. It was simply a good place to fish, a bank in the middle of nowhere. The name comes from the old fishing boats, the doggers, small, sturdy vessels that worked these grounds long ago. And it was the men aboard boats like these who first began to pull the secret up out of the dark. Because every so often, when they hauled in their nets, something came up with the fish that did not belong to the sea at all. Lumps of a strange black peat. The fishermen called it moorlog. It smelled of rot and old earth, and it clogged their nets, and they cursed it and threw most of it back. But peat does not form at the bottom of the ocean. Peat forms in bogs and marshes and damp forest floors. On land, dry land. The sea was handing them pieces of a landscape that should not exist. And then there were the bones. Trawlers brought up the tusks of mammoths, the teeth of woolly rhinoceros, the antlers of giant deer, and the jaws of bison and wild horse. Animals of the cold, open plains, dredged from beneath 100 feet of salt water, far out of sight of any coast. For a long time, people assumed the sea had simply scattered them there. The truth was stranger and quieter and far more beautiful. These animals had lived here. They had walked across this place when it was not a seafloor at all, but a floor of grass. In the autumn of 1931, a trawler called the Kalinda was fishing these waters by night. As the crew worked the catch, one man's shovel struck something hard. Buried in a block of that black moorlog, he broke the lump open. Inside was a spear point, a harpoon carved from deer antler, its edge still lined with fine barbs. It had been made by human hands, and it had lain in that peat beneath the North Sea for more than 8,000 years. That single spear point changed everything. Because someone had to have stood here to throw it, someone had hunted here. And slowly, over the decades that followed, scientists pieced together what that meant. The land beneath the southern North Sea, the whole vast basin between Britain and the Netherlands, between England and Denmark, had once been above the waves. It was not a strait. It was not a channel. It was a country, and it had a population, and rivers, and seasons, and a horizon. We have given it a name. We call it Doggerland. So let us go back. Let the water rise away in your mind, and the cold grey sea drain off the land, and the light change. We are going to stand in Doggerland on an ordinary morning about 10,000 years ago. There is no sea here, there is no Britain and no Europe. Only one unbroken land, running flat and green and golden to every edge of the world you can see. This is a low country, a gentle country. Great slow rivers wind across it, the ancestors of the Thames and the Rhine, flowing together here into broad marshes and reed beds before they ever reach the sea. The water is everywhere. In lakes, in still pools, in the slow brown channels that braid across the plain. It is some of the richest land that has ever existed in this corner of the earth. And it is quiet. So quiet. Only the wind in the reeds and the water, and far off, the call of birds. Inland from the marshes, the land rises a little into open woodland. Birch and pine and hazel scattered across grassy plains. Red deer move through the trees, wild boar root in the leaf litter. Beavers dam the smaller streams and flood the hollows, making new wetlands that draw in geese and ducks and cranes by the thousand. For the people who live here, this is not a wilderness. It is a larder. It is home. They are few, and they move with the seasons, following the deer and the fish and the ripening of the hazelnuts. They build light shelters by the water's edge and leave little behind but the bones of their meals, the flint they shaped, and now and then a tool of antler or bone dropped in the mud and slowly swallowed by the peat. They do not know they are living on the floor of a future sea. Why would they? The land has been here longer than any story they could tell. To them, it is simply the world. We know them mostly by what they left in the ground. Tiny blades of flint, no bigger than a fingernail, set into wooden shafts to make arrows and harpoons. We call these people Mesolithic, the people of the Middle Stone Age. They were not primitive. They knew this land the way you know the rooms of your own house in the dark. Every channel, every crossing, every island of high ground that stayed dry when the floods came. They knew where the eels ran in spring and where the swans nested, and they were about to watch all of it disappear. Because far to the north, the world was changing. The great ice sheets of the last ice age, kilometers thick, locking up the world's water, were melting. They had been melting for thousands of years, and all that water had to go somewhere. It ran into the oceans, and the seas of the world began, very slowly, to rise. Not as a wave, not as a flood you could see in a single lifetime. The sea rose by perhaps a meter or two in a century, a hand's width in a year. Slow enough that no one alive would say the sea is coming, but fast enough that, over the generations, the lowest marshes turned to brackish lagoon, and the lagoons turned to open salt water, and the old hunting grounds where your grandfather walked were now a place you could only reach by boat. Year by year, the coastline crept inland. The Great Plain shrank, the rivers drowned their own valleys. What had been one vast country slowly broke into a scatter of low islands in a widening sea. And the people, and the deer, and the wild horses drew back onto the higher ground that remained. Onto the long, shallow rise we now call the Doggerbank, which in those last centuries was not a sandbank at all, but an island, a green island, alone in a young grey sea. For a while, life went on there, on that last island, in the middle of what is now the North Sea. The deer still grazed, the birds still came, but the world it belonged to was already gone. Drowned slowly all around it, fathom by fathom, century by century. And then, around 8,000 years ago, far off the coast of Norway, the edge of the sea floor gave way. An enormous slab of underwater sediment slid into the deep. A collapse called the Storegga Slide. It pushed the ocean ahead of it. And a wave rose and crossed the young North Sea and swept across the low remains of Doggerland. We don't know how much was left to take by then. Perhaps only that final island, perhaps only memory. The wave passed. The water settled, and the last high ground of the drowned country slipped quietly beneath the surface and did not come back. After that, there was only sea. The same cold, restless sea that the fishermen would sail across thousands of years later, never knowing what lay beneath their keels. And it is all still down there, not gone, only hidden. The old rivers still run as buried channels in the seabed. The hills are still hills beneath the sand. Somewhere under the dark water lie the marshes and the woodland floors and the quiet places by the reeds where people once sat by their fires. We are only beginning to map it now. With sound and core samples and the patient reading of the sea floor, a drowned country slowly coming back into focus. The most complete lost world we have ever found, and the gentlest. No catastrophe in a day, only water rising the way sleep rises, slowly and then completely. So rest now, there is nothing left to watch for. The tide has long since turned. The country is safe beneath the water, exactly where it has always been. Sleep well. The sea will keep its long, quiet watch over the drowned land until the morning.